like to give you over the next hour. And first, I want to welcome everyone, especially if this is your first webinar. We are presenting today, Transforming Clinical Trials Using Artificial Intelligence. My name is Angie Price. I'm the Director of Education and Marketing Communications, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. I look forward to spending the next 60 minutes learning more about AI. I certainly know that I need to learn more, its applications, the FDA's strategic approach to incorporating AI, and finally, the IRB's perspective on the challenges, risks, and benefits of using artificial intelligence in clinical trials. Before we get started, I'll cover a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. A copy will be sent to you, as well as posted on our website and our site network portal. A link to the portal will be posted in the chat, where you can have access to it. Speaking of the chat, we encourage you to use that feature to ask questions, and hopefully, if time permits, we will address some of those questions at the end of the webinar. A little bit about IACT. We are a non-for-profit, and we work with patients, sites, and pharmaceutical companies to expedite pediatric drug development. It's a mission that inspires hope and promises brighter futures for pediatric healthcare. We aim to accomplish this by providing comprehensive support to a network of over 70 trial-ready sites through mentoring, quality improvement initiatives, regulatory support, and educational webinars like this one. We aim to equip our sites with everything they need to be successful. We also work with pharmaceutical companies on pediatric clinical trial design, strategic planning, developing clinical pharmacology strategies, and other aspects of pediatric product development. We also have a wealth of global pediatric experts who are prepared to provide advice on pediatric clinical research, ensuring that pediatric studies are thoughtfully designed to meet regulatory requirements and address specific health needs of children. Our goal is to expedite pediatric drug development by reducing the approval time from 9 to 5 years. We know this is a lofty goal, but we know that children don't have time to wait. And now it is my privilege to introduce our speakers today. First, we have Billy Umzal, the visionary CEO of Quintiles Health. Billy is a European leader in artificial intelligence and machine learning. He has a rich 20-year history, and he currently has developed cutting-edge quantitative methodologies that have revolutionized strategic decision-making in healthcare. His talk today will provide a comprehensive overview of AI, highlighting the significant changes over the last 2 decades, backed by compelling case studies and AI applications. Next, we have Dr. Khair El-Zarad, who serves as the Deputy Director of the Office of Medical Policy at FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. In this pivotal role, he is responsible for developing, coordinating, and implementing medical policy programs and strategic initiatives. Dr. El-Zarad will be talking today about developing policies that provide regulatory predictability and clarity for the use of AI innovations, as well as clinical applications and ethical considerations. Finally, we have James Riddle, the Senior Vice President of Global Review Operations at Avera. He has over 25 years of experience providing support to the clinical research community in its operational responsibility for global review services. In this role, he helps CROs, sponsors, and research sites advance their clinical research with the mission to improve human health. James will share today the IRB's perspective on what research needs to know to be fully prepared and safely leverage the power of AI. And now, without further ado, I will turn the webinar over to Billy to provide an overview of AI and how it's applied in clinical trials. Welcome, Billy. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Angie, and thank you very much for the invitation. So today I'm going to speak about how AI can be very impactful in clinical trials, and specifically also for pediatric trials. But first, what is AI? How can we define artificial intelligence? Broadly speaking, we could say that it is a machine's ability to perform some cognitive functions that we usually associate with human minds. So really, the machine mimicking humans' reasoning and acting. But this is a broad definition. Of course, within AI, we include other concepts or tools that you may be familiar with, like machine learning, or within machine learning, which is the the capability of a machine to learn on existing data. Within machine learning, we have deep learning and also more specifically generative AI, which you may be familiar by using ChatGPT, which is basically mostly about generative AI. An application of machine learning to languages and text data is called natural language processing, so NLP, and is used to also learn from large bodies of text, typically from the internet or from bodies of publications, for example. Now, how does AI apply to drug development? Here, I'm focusing on development, not discovery. So really specifically on clinical development, three main use cases that you can think of and that where AI can be very impactful: exploration, automation, and prediction. So exploration, this is about exploring data to identify patient subgroups, high responders to a treatment, for example, or fast progressors or clusters of endotypes, or to help also to support the development of earlier diagnosis algorithms. Second, automation. So this is more about automating processes within clinical development, for example, around evidence generation or evidence synthesis, or to automate some analytical steps within the data management or the data analysis. And third, prediction. So there, this is about projecting or predicting outcomes, could be clinical outcomes, economic outcomes, at patient level or at population levels, to really be able to either extrapolate what would be the patient's trajectory in his journey, in his disease journey, or even to simulate new patients that are not observed and that could be highly likely potential patients. So sometimes we speak about digital twins or in silico trials, really that enabled, for example, the simulation of external control arms to complement or augment a trial. More concretely, more concretely, what are the typical use cases? Before that, just a word, because I have been discussing about these AI and these fancy names that are very sometimes that makes the buzz, but really drug development. I mean, we know that we have been learning from data with using statistical learning, Bayesian statistical methodologies. Here, this is an example that is 20 years old, where we were actually already compiling historical data, simulating patients, phase 1, 2, 3 trials, and already predicting what would be the chance of success of the clinical development in a rare condition. So where here it was about spinal cord injury, where patients are very hard to recruit, very difficult to recruit, so very sparse data. And we were able to to do this kind of work and to submit that to health authorities, for example. So what's new? What's new from 20 years ago? Well, first, we have much stronger algorithms, much stronger IT environments, much stronger computers, which of course augment dramatically the power of the impact of what we can do with AI. Second, we have more and better data. So speaking about, for example, the access of real-world data or the access of large data platforms, especially now that we have developed much more the standards to exchange data, even data from hospitals or from studies are getting more and more standardized and accessible, also with the regulation that is now handling the data access processes much more stringently. And third, of course, more experience and recognition. We have more history and people have more experience and acceptance, basically. They are more familiar with the use of such approaches, so it makes the whole environment easier to work on, and that makes things very much more impactful ultimately. Now, what I was describing here was really about generating synthetic data. So when we simulate patients' history, so you can think about matching to historical data, but beyond that, being able to simulate really the trajectory of a disease of the disease of a patient at patient level over time, and sometimes even over a very long time, the time that you could not really access within the trial setting. So the idea here is to enable AI algorithms to learn not only from one or two trials, but really from all relevant existing trials and real-world data to generate such plausible synthetic patients. And this is easier said than done. And of course, in practice, this is not one single algorithm that is applied to one perfect data source. Typically, we combine multiple data sources with multiple algorithms to learn from claims databases, from observational studies, from publications, and of course, from historical trials, to learn about how patients progresses, to learn about the complexity of progression and the heterogeneity in progression patterns, but also to learn about drug exposure, to learn about the standard of care, the responders, so who are the responders and what drives response and so on. So read all the elements that allows you to all together simulate what could be a virtual cohort of patients in the long term, and simulate within that cohort what if scenarios in terms of treatments, in terms of positioning a drug, and adapted it to local health systems and local practices. So this is just the overall holistic view on how AI can be very powerful and transform drug development and care ultimately. Now, a few case studies to illustrate those three typical use cases, as I mentioned: exploration, automation, and prediction. So starting with the explorations, really the understanding of the disease complexity and heterogeneity. Here I'm referring to a rare disease, a rare condition, Huntington disease, for which the progression is already pretty complex and heterogeneous in the long term. And the goal here was to understand that complexity to some extent and to really identify clusters of patients' endotypes and really to identify what drive this progression in order to, within a drug development context, to better position a drug, to optimize trial designs, so to maximize the chance of success of those designs, and ultimately to be able to simulate the standard of care, or synthetic control, again, with the view to minimize the data collection, and ultimately to accelerate the patient access to a potential new drug. So what we did, we developed machine learning algorithms to identify those clusters and characterize them. And we developed what we call a Bayesian dynamic progression model to basically enable the simulation of new patients. And you can see, you can see on the picture the different clusters of progressors, and you can see the impact that from that study was that we could really augment, so increase the chance of success from 20 to 50%, depending on the target populations. And that was also used to simulate synthetic control arms, so basically to decrease massively the sample size. Second example, automation. So this is an example that was actually requested by a health authority in Europe about the use of large language models. So this is these language processing algorithms applied to literature data publications. The idea here, the goal was to automate extensive evidence synthesis from the literature in order to identify the standard, the safety issues, safety events, severe adverse events, to identify them and basically quantify them depending on the indication, on the treatment, and the patient profiles. So that's a tedious work manually. There was a team doing that, dedicated to that within the agency. And the idea was to basically learn from them and really accelerate dramatically their work. So we implemented an NLP algorithms there. And we actually not only applied the algorithms, but also developed a whole dashboard to really fit into their workflow. And you can see the impact was very impressive in terms of acceleration and in terms of increase performance and accuracy. Last example, this is about prediction. So here, the idea was to simulate patients, synthetic patients from existing data. So this is in the context of an HIV pediatric trial. So to prevent the mother-to-child transmission, so from pregnant infected women to their child. So you can imagine that the difficulty in recruitment, it was in the context of Southeast Asia. So how to recruit. Also, the practices were moving over time pretty fast, so it was difficult to really build a meaningful trial within a short time. So the idea was to replace a three-arm trials, like classical trial, by a one single-arm trial versus what the synthetic data would provide from our modeling and AI algorithms. So that's what we did. Basically, we divided by 5, in this case, the total sample size initially planned for. And fortunately, the results of the trials were successful, was positive, and it was instrumental to actually change the WHO guidelines. And ultimately, it eradicated the transmission in those countries. So now we are doing the same project in Africa. Last word would be to kind of give a perspective on, oh, this may be one slide. It's okay. Oh, that's here is it. A perspective on the European regulatory framework. So AI is definitely in the agenda of EMA. We are working with them, for example, to leverage adult trials and with AI and machine learning, and use this information to reduce, to accelerate and reduce the size of pediatric trials. Now you see that basically the horizon for delivering guidance documents and really a complete set of policies and tools by EMA would be by 2027. So a few years more towards really deploying AI within EMA in Europe. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Billy, so much for laying the foundation for AI and its potential for pediatric drug development. It is now my honor to turn the webinar over to Dr. El-Zarad to discuss the FDA strategic approach to AI. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much. First of all, thanks to Billy for a great presentation and really great examples of how we can move the field utilizing AI. And thanks also to you all in IACT for your work on behalf of the pediatric patients and to all of you who are attending the meeting today. As mentioned, my name is Kirill Zarad. I lead the Office of Medical Policy at the Center for Drugs, and part of our work is really to anticipate new innovations such as AI and ask questions like, are our regulations ready to manage those innovations robustly? So the AI obviously is within the realm of what we're focusing on right now. So today I will give you hopefully a little bit of a flavor on what we are seeing as a regulatory agency and what we have done so far around AI. And then I will go over how we are approaching AI regulations at a very high level, and then future steps and perspectives. Let's see if my slides are moving. Here we go. So, Billy presented a very nice and positive look about how AI can be utilized, but I just want to take us back to the basics a little bit and just remember, why do we need to do better in general around clinical trials? So this is just an illustration that many of you, I'm sure, familiar of, is just so how long it takes for a drug to come from a basic compound all the way to an approved drug. And this process can take several years, and we haven't made much progress here. I think we really need to go much further in accelerating the development. This is another piece of data that's actually 7 or 8 years old. It shows the cost in millions of dollars for the clinical development of a drug per therapeutic area. And as you can see, we're talking about tens, if not sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars. So the cost is really massive, and that continues to be so as well. We haven't made much progress in that area. But in general, clinical trials continue to fail, and continue to fail for basic reasons. For example, problem in recruitment and retention. We've seen many trials, especially in academia and the public sector, failing because of that. So to conclude, many trials are still costly, still complex, still burdensome, and they do not incorporate innovations the way we hope they would incorporate. And I have to mention COVID, obviously. Like during COVID, many trials did not produce generalizable results. They're either too small, single arm, and nobody relied on them or able to rely on them to make a decision. However, there are good examples of large-scale trials that were embedded in healthcare sectors that utilize technologies, remote capture technologies, and were very successful at producing good results. So that's the ecosystem that we're hoping, not just AI, but the technology in general, the tools, the innovation in design will help us advance. So moving from there a little bit, when we start looking at where is AI used in drug development, we found it's been utilized across the spectrum of drug development, all the way from early discovery to non-clinical research, for example, PK/PD modeling, clinical research. I'm going to talk a little bit more about clinical research, and then manufacturing and post-market safety monitoring. And the last part sometimes I feel like it's ignored a little bit, but the AI use in manufacturing is extremely promising and it's an important aspect as well. So we start looking at our own application, what's coming in-house for us as an agency. And we found out that actually, if you look at the lower part of the graph, if you see the largest number, 118 of applications utilizing AI are actually in clinical research. So that area that we discussed before, it's very expensive. It's very much takes a lot of time and efforts and resources. So we were really excited to see clinical research specifically benefiting from that. For those who are not familiar with our types of application, we put the abbreviation, what they mean below. This is just different maturation of the product practically. And we were hoping to see more and more of AI utilization across the spectrum here. Now, this data is a little bit old. As you see, it's from 2021. We're updating this data, and I can tell you the trend is continuing, including the focus on clinical research. So we're very excited, and the link below for those who are interested in this paper. So what we have done in the last few years. So in 2019, the Center for Drugs, CDER, established the AI Steering Committee because we realized quickly we need a little bit more of a coherent approach to make sure not just that the technology is safe and utilized appropriately, but also that those promising innovations are being incorporated in an effective way. We also established the community of practice. We published a framework. We established a framework working group at that time, and we started tracking AI uses. Like Billy mentioned, the definition of what AI is, we had a bigger umbrella of what's considered AI when we start tracking. So moving from there, we had a public meeting, a workshop with our collaborators, the Duke Margolis, that tried to address how AI is being utilized in drug development to help us map realistically on the ground who's using what and what areas are most promising. We want to avoid the hype, if you would, a little bit. And then we published the analysis that I showed you before and where we're seeing AI in our applications. And from there, we published 2 discussion papers that are available publicly showing how we are thinking about AI. In 2024, we have the executive order that highlight the importance of, the government, the federal government, understanding how AI can be utilized in a safe, secure, and trustworthy manner. So from there, we also published a paper about how we are working together. One of the fears of the community that was expressed to us is that we may work at AI from the point of view of devices and a little bit different from the point of view of drugs and biologics. We are working together as a coherent body, and we want to highlight that in this paper. And then finally, we did a workshop just last month, and I highly advise you, we're going to have the link for that workshop on my slides, to really take a look at that workshop. I approached this workshop with a little bit of an ego, thinking I know quite a bit about the field, and I was really humble, learning so much happening there. That's it's both obstacles and both opportunities. I think really good to be mindful of. Moving from there, touching a little bit on the executive order, because as a federal agency ourselves, we have to abide by executive orders. And in this specific executive orders on AI, it includes 150 requirements, among them 8 specific to HHS. This has included language related to drug and devices, for example, to define the objectives, goals, and high-level principles required for the appropriate regulations throughout each phase of drug development. So it's very clear mandate to the FDA, start providing what, the understanding, the principles around the regulation here. So when we published our framework paper, we highlighted really key areas we want to work on. For example, fostering collaboration. This is really important because we're a relatively large agency, but we understand that we do not have the spectrum of experience within our staff. So we have to rely on collaboration, mutual learning opportunities. We want to work to advance the development of regulatory approaches of how to regulate, not just how to incorporate AI. We want to support research that's specifically related to the evaluation and monitoring of AI, again, the responsible use of AI. And finally, we want to promote the development of harmonized standards. And as you can imagine, this is important that hopefully us in the US, our colleagues in Canada, our colleagues in Europe, Japan, will utilize hopefully the same language and the same concepts. So those are really the focus areas. So when we start working on our guidance that will be published this year, this is guidance that's under the executive order. We have to publish it this year. And we focused on how AI is used to produce data or information to support regulatory decision-making. So the decision-making link here is really important for us. Our work on the guidance is informed by FDA's experiences in reviewing over 300, I think now it's over 500 submissions. And we received over 800 comments on the discussion paper that we published and the input during public meetings, as well as current regulatory science research. So what we wanted to do is to provide a risk-based framework for establishing and evaluating credibility of AI use in regulatory decision-making. And we want to help ensure that AI models used to answer those questions are sufficiently credible for a particular context of use. And you're going to hear me say this word a lot, context of use, because it's really important to understand how AI is used, in what context, and who are the players within that context. Moving to how our guidance was informed by the discussion papers, this is something we get asked a lot about. So what did we learn from publishing the discussion paper? So in the discussion paper, we highlighted that our goals is to have to address key issues: human-led governance, accountability and transparency, quality, reliability, and the representativeness of the data. This is linked to bias, of course, and model development, performance monitoring, and validation. This paper published last year and in collaboration across all the centers, and we had 800 comments from over 65 entities, which is highlight the interest in this area. So what did we learn from all those 800 comments? We tried to summarize this by those factors here. There is a question for asking for clarity on what falls within and outside of the scope of the FDA oversight. Obviously, early development, sometimes compound development, the early chemistry and biochemistry may not necessarily fall within the FDA oversight. And then clarity on how to operationalize the risk-based approach. We keep talking about risk-based approach. What does that mean? And then clarity on transparency and the level of details and documentation required as an agency, regulatory agency. What do we want to see to ensure transparency? And then we had a call for harmonization globally and alignment with medical devices. So drugs, devices, biologics were all speaking with one voice. And then a call for the establishment of partnerships to advance the creation and sharing of machine-readable data. As you can all, I'm sure, tell, data is really the core here, and the quality of the data is a critical aspect of making sure AI is responsive to our need. So moving from there a little bit, this is the risk-based approach that we're trying to highlight and articulate, and you will hopefully see some of that in our guidelines as well. This risk-based approach is really anchored in the context of use. So below here, you see what do we mean by model risk metrics. And then the two things I want you to pay attention to, the model risk moves from low to high, and there's two elements to it: the decision consequence and model influence. Those two are major factors that we're going to be looking at as a regulatory agency. And those two factors actually are determined independently from each other. So I'll give an example in a minute, but depending on model risk, the level and stringency of credibility evidence may differ. Take, for example, if you have an algorithm that's flagging certain radiology imaging, for a physician or a radiologist to take a look at or to prioritize. Ultimately, the decision will be for that radiologist to either accept or deny or reject practically the recommendation from the algorithm. So there may be a variation here in the decision consequence and the influence of the model itself. Compare that to when you have an algorithm that may determine the combination of chemotherapeutic products that a patient would receive. So obviously the risk here and the consequence of the decision is really much higher. So that's the kind of thing, the context of use, understanding the elements around it is going to be critical for this model we're proposing here. So what's next? In short term, we want to publish our guidelines, and we hope to get feedback. When we publish the guideline, we ask for feedback. We are hoping to work on best practices that can be shared across all parties. We're calling them good machine learning practices. There's some work done on that area. We want to continue to develop consistent terminology. We think that's something we heard about quite a bit from our audience. And we want to continue to engage with all interested parties. And this is the link below of the workshop I mentioned. I highly recommend this workshop for those of you who are interested. And if you heard very recently, actually, just in the last couple of weeks, we established a new council, which is called the AI Governance Council on behalf of CEDAR, that hopefully will make all our efforts coordinated around the same focus. So for the long term, we want to continue our responsive risk-based regulation. So we're not approaching this in a way that's fear-mongering in a way. We want to understand the context. We want to have responsive regulations that both safeguard the public, but also advance the technology. We want to continue to advance the regulatory science specifically in this area. And we want to continue our collaborative approach with our community at large. We think this last bullet is so critical for us. Collectively, we have to advance the field. So I will leave you with this. AI, I don't believe is going to be the silver bullet. The same thing we thought about large data sets, for example, big data, digital health technology. There's so much happening in this area that I think we have to advance everything together. We have to advance trial design, trial conduct, the technology is being used. And here are just some examples of what we are working on simultaneously to advance the field. You will notice all the way from a protocol design to clinical trial design elements in decentralization, for example, to AI, digital health technology, and electronic systems, and good clinical practice as well. We are hoping that we can together address all of this at the same time, not thinking of a single technology as the silver bullet. And finally, everything I presented to you is really credit goes to my wonderful colleagues here at the FDA. I want to mention specifically from among them, Tala Fahouri, who actually I stole most of my slides from her. She's the brain behind a lot of the work that we've seen, as well as all my colleagues listed here. Thank you so much for your attention. Look forward to the discussion. Back to you, Angie.
Thank you, Dr. Elzarad. It's kind of reassuring that the FDA is laying the pathwork to oversee AI through the whole drug development cycle. There's a lot of different pieces that I know that I hadn't thought about that AI is going to be applied to. And that, that collaboration piece is so important. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn it over to James Riddle to speak about IRB perspective when approaching AI in research. Welcome, James.
All right, thanks, Angie, and thank you all attendees for tuning in to listen today. Going to talk a bit about how the IRB feels about artificial intelligence. And I suspect we probably will be back in about a year when the technology has advanced and give fresh perspectives from the IRB on where AI is going, what we are seeing relative to research with AI embedded components. This moving so fast, it is hard to keep up. A little bit about me. Thank you, Angie, for the nice intro. I assume these slides will be available to the attendees. You can read about that later. I have no relevant financial disclosures or relationships to disclose as part of this educational activity. And before I dive into the IRB world, just a short word about Advara. If you're not familiar with Advara, we are in the space of providing research oversight to the very important clinical trials and other human research that occurs to develop new cures. Our primary mission, though, is the advancement of human health. We're here to help facilitate the researchers getting to the answers that will drive the next set of cures and help people's lives. An important topic. But first, a question. And here's the question for all of you to consider. As an ethics oversight committee, the Institutional Review Board, or ethics committee if you're in Canada, what should we do differently, if anything, relative to projects that have an AI component? I mean, has AI really fundamentally changed the question of when is it okay to experiment on another human being in a great way? And so I'd like to start there because I think it does help to frame how the IRB thinks about and approaches our review of research in understanding how we're reacting as a IRB community to projects that have an AI component. And first and foremost, for those of you who are not part of the IRB world, when you send your research projects off to the IRB, we are running your research through an ethical lens founded in the Belmont Principles. These are the 3 principles. If you've gone through human subject protection training, which if any of you have NIH grant-funded studies or have worked with an IRB for any length of time, you probably have. These ethical principles haven't changed. AI hasn't changed them. Big data sets didn't change them. The advent of innovative gene therapies did not change these fundamental principles of how an IRB will evaluate a research project and determine, based on the parameters of the research project, is there an appropriate respect for person? Is the beneficence ratio positive? And is there an equitable selection of subjects? Those 3 ethical principles have not changed. What has changed is the technology that is available inside the clinical trial. The framework of the clinical trial designs have changed, have gotten more advanced. Technologies have been introduced, like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the like. But at its core, the IRB is still looking at these 3 ethical principles in order to determine whether the research is approvable or not. And how does the ethical principles manifest themselves in real life? Ethical principles are lovely, but our colleagues at the Food and Drug Administration have provided us with rules that we have to follow in the form of regulation. Our colleagues over at the Office of Human Research Protection have a similar set of rules. These are known as the 111 criteria. You can go Google those regulatory references up at the top of the slide, and you will find the rather lengthy version of these. This is the James Riddle paraphrased version of the 111 criteria. And so if you are a regulatory wonk like myself, you will go and Google these criteria, but these are what the IRB needs to find are true before it can approve a research project. And that could be a research project that is first in human. It could be research projects involving late phase observational studies, could be survey research, etc. If it's an FDA-regulated clinical investigation, 21 CFR 56-111 applies. These are the rules. Now, how does this relate to AI? So if there's an AI component in the research, the first 2 of these rules have a very important role to play. And here's how AI impacts when the IRB comes to town to look at your protocol. So first and foremost, I've highlighted a couple of keywords here out of the James Riddle paraphrased version of the regulations. And in the 111A1 criteria, there is a component of the criteria that says does not or do not unnecessarily expose subjects to risk. Okay, then you go on to the next clause, which is risks to subjects are reasonable in relationship to the knowledge that may reasonably be expected. Emphasis on reasonably be expected to result has a fundamental impact on the amount of risk. Go back to item number 1, risks to subjects are minimized and resources do not unnecessarily expose subjects to risk. Well, what kinds of risk does an AI component in the research represent? Well, it can be a very direct risk. If you consider that we utilize artificial intelligence in clinical care to do things like evaluate scans, evaluate lab results, to aid clinicians in making decisions, perhaps not making the decision for them, but certainly aiding them in the decision-making process. If there is an AI component that is directing the clinical care or the randomization events or the eligibility criteria into the protocol, you have a direct impact of, if the AI doesn't work, it's not properly built, or Dr. El-Zarad used the terminology, and this is very appropriate, sufficiently credible for the appropriate use. Well, if the randomization algorithm of the AI doesn't work properly, we are going to unnecessarily expose subjects to risk that they wouldn't otherwise be subject to as part of the research, absent the AI component. It's a direct correlation between the AI component and just exactly how risky that AI component is. There can also be tangential risk that you may not necessarily gain knowledge from the research if the AI component does not generate sufficiently credible results. For instance, Billy talked about synthetic control arms. Very possible now with the advent of AI to generate a synthetically, no pun intended, generated data set that is utilized to verify that the research is working properly. And also those synthetic control arms go to the regulatory agencies to help make decisions about whether the drug should be approved or the device should be approved. But if those synthetic control arms, if the AI algorithm that is generating them gets it wrong or not accurate enough, then the folks who are in the real world control arm, not the synthetic data that's been generated, but the folks who are in the real world control arm, have been subjected to risk, but there's no reasonably expected knowledge to be gained because the synthetic control arm is not something we can compare to. That's a little bit more of a stretch for the IRB, but it is another example of how AI can introduce risk into the research. So what should the IRB do about this? Well, the AI components of the research need to be evaluated by the IRB, just like any other component of the research. If you were to introduce some form of decentralized clinical trial technology to gather data or make decisions or do, for instance, dose escalation calculations, et cetera, the IRB would want to know how those decentralized clinical trial technologies impact risk inside the research. Same question for AI that the IRBs need to be thinking about in relation to the 111 criteria. So if you're talking about children, which I suspect most of you who are listening to the webinar will be, considering your relationship with IACT, there is an additional component of risk relative to IRB review of research involving children that has a tie to the 111 criteria, but you'll notice the additional, and again, this is the James Riddle paraphrased version of a bunch of words out of the regulations, but the 405, 406, 407, or in FDA parlance, the 52, 53, 54 findings are based off of some wiggle words: prospect, likely, opportunity. Well, those are all judgments, and those judgments impact risk. If you notice, the first part is minimal risk, more than minimal risk, more than minimal risk. Well, you're comparing it to risk. And so much in the same way on the last slide that we were thinking about AI introducing risk, the IRB needs to understand how does utilizing AI as a research component impact these judgment words as it relates to research involving children, and that can impact the child risk determination. And then there's an additional component for the IRB to consider when you talk about AI, or quite frankly, any other virtual trial technology. And that is, what do you tell people in the consent form under the ethical principle of respect for persons. So, under the FDA and OHRP regulation, there is requirement for a description of any reasonably foreseeable risks or discomforts to the subject. So consent forms always have a description of procedure, data collection, etc. But the IRB needs to consider, is any risk associated with the AI adequately disclosed? And how would you disclose those AI component risks? Such as, if, and for instance, if the AI that's used in the trial is determining dose escalation. I haven't seen a trial that's doing that yet, but not hard to imagine that there would be some AI component that goes into, is it time to do dose escalation, or perhaps a randomization decision based on an AI-enabled brain scan or tissue scan or something of that nature. Well, do you disclose to the participant that randomization into one arm or the other is decided by an artificial intelligence? Is that something that is a reasonably foreseeable risk that needs to be disclosed to the subject, a la 21 CFR 5025A? Probably. James Riddle's opinion. Each IRB needs to weigh this against what is going on with the use of the AI. Perhaps it needs to be disclosed, perhaps not. This is a judgment call based on the IRB's relationship and their interaction with this clause of reasonably foreseeable. Well, what is reasonably foreseeable? That's why you have an ethics committee with lots of folks from different backgrounds that get together and decide what is reasonably foreseeable. Because if we knew exactly reasonably foreseeable, we wouldn't need IRBs sometimes in order to write these things. But that's another component for how the AI needs to interact with the IRB. Now, what should the IRB be focused on? So for all of my IRB colleagues who might be in the audience here, what you focus on for AI is the same things that you focus on for any other project. Look at risk. Is risk minimized? Does it fit the 111 criteria? Are there adequate provisions to protect privacy and confidentiality? Same analysis that you would go through with any other technology-enabled project. The consent and assent. Is there an appropriate disclosure in the consent? It's the same thing that we've done for decades, just with a new technology and a new set of AI components. So in summation, here's the IRB's perspective. That was my charge for this part of the webinar. And from the Advara perspective, this is how we're viewing AI. Short story, until the regulatory agencies tell us to treat this differently than we've been treating any other kind of technology for the last 30 years, we're going to continue to run protocols that have an AI component through the ethical lens of the Belmont Report and the regulatory criteria of the 111. And that's how we're going to treat it. So if you are on an IRB or run an IRB or in the IRB office or interact with an IRB at your academic institution, and they're asking more questions about AI, good, because it does need to have some questions around it, just like any other technology that gets introduced. But those questions should be grounded in the ethical principles of the Belmont Report and also be reasonable in relation to the anticipated risk that might be generated from the AI. And with that, I think we are at questions. So I'll hand it back to Angie.
Yes, thank you so much. A lot to digest. I have had several questions sent to me directly. And the first question, I think you might have spoken to this a little bit, but I'll kind of ask it in a different way. And this is for the IRB. So when you talk about risks, are you talking about individual risk to a person or to a population as a whole? What are we looking at there? Because I know that you're reviewing protocols for a specific indication.
Yeah, I think the short answer is it really will depend on the context of the research that's in front of the IRB and the utilization of the AI inside the project. So for instance, if the artificial intelligence is being used to aid researchers in identifying brain tumors in children, and the artificial intelligence has been trained on a large data set of brain scans in order to be able to more accurately detect emerging glioblastomas in children, there is a risk that the AI was trained wrong, and that particular unapproved artificial intelligence guide might have a direct impact on the participant or their child who's enrolled in the study. The AI gets it wrong, they might be enrolled in the wrong arm, they might get the wrong dose, they might be unnecessarily excluded from the research when maybe they could have been included. Now, that's a theoretical risk because we use AI-enabled clinical technology quite frequently now. I mean, if you go to the doctor and get a scan, it's not outside the realm of possibility that there's some machine learning or machine trained algorithm that's helping the physician or the technician that's reading the scan pinpoint a certain thing. So that would be a direct risk. You talked about population risk. If the artificial intelligence is generating synthetic control arms, then somewhere there's a person who's either taking the drug or having the device implanted or on them or something. And if the synthetic control arm is not working properly or generates inaccurate or unusable data, the individuals may not be impacted directly, but certainly society as a whole is not going to benefit from knowledge on that research because you can't use the synthetic control arm. Again, a hypothetical risk, but one that is a unique question, I think, for IRBs to ask when they take a look at any protocol involving technology. IRBs should be asking, is the technology validated? How is it being used? Is it fit for purpose? All of the things that we've been instructed to look at from the FDA via the computer system software validation. I know I'm going back a ways, back into the 90s, but all of those same GAMP5 testing methodologies still apply.
So with that answer, we've had a blow up of questions around
Oh my.
Accuracy. So I think this question might be for Billy at first. They're asking, like, you know, how do you make sure the algorithms are giving you the right information? I'm trying to, like, what monitoring and quality assurance, like those type of things. Of course, you know, we're in a lot of people that work in this industry are worried about how the FDA is going to regulate that. Are they going to find audit findings? Like, how do you kind of manage that, those risks and quality?
Yeah. Maybe I can answer on the technical side. So indeed, I did not highlight it too much, but the validation process is essential. And there is barely one size fits all algorithms. It has to be developed and validated for specific use cases, and often in medical research, also for specific populations, sometimes for some countries and so on. So the validation process is a very large part of AI development, AI tools development, and validation and deployment. It's not also a one-off exercise because AI tools may learn over time, so they may change. So basically, that implies that also the validation and you may say the quality control of the tools under the condition of use is also validated, keeps being validated over time as well. So that's an essential part of it. And there are, of course, technologies and techniques to do that. And an AI tool should always come with a scope of validity associated to it. And I think the guidelines, the regulatory guidelines and other guidance, methodological guidance documents will document that in details.
Thank you.
Can I add to that, Angie, a little bit?
Yes, and the next
Yeah.
question's for you too, so you can just keep adding. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I would, since we're talking about the monitoring plans, like I think what Billy mentioned about AI that evolves really as the data is generated too. I think that from a monitoring perspective, should have a specific consideration, especially if the context of use may be altered, and the risk profile may be altered as the AI evolves, and maybe the decision-making process, the interaction with the patients or other healthcare professionals may change as a result of those updates. So that's something I think we need to think about carefully. But we do in general see monitoring plans for clinical trial using AI, and I think but for the most part for fixed algorithm, I think that those generative AI or evolving algorithm, learning algorithms, going to have specific consideration. And the other thing I was going to mention, I'm curious, like probably Billy and James have a better data on this. One thing that worries me a lot, like I came from NIH, where you have to publish your data, and you typically publish when you have positive results, right? Like you typically the accumulation of data is typically positive data. Negative data, either not get published or take a second seat, if you would, or have different data repositories. And I'm worried that AI, the learning data sets are really coming from those positive results, and we're not really paying attention to the negative results, which is really critical for if you want to have a model that's considered the totality of data available. That's something worries me, and I'm not sure. Again, I'm not the expert here. I think Billy and James may have much better perspective here than I do, but just something to worry.
Yeah, very good point. And I think that unless you advise your AI that there is a publication bias and it should reflect, it should adjust for it. Yes, this is a risk. This is also why it's important to often confront published trial data with real-world data as far as possible, as relevant, of course, where, of course, there is no publication bias anymore, and that could also, be very, very beneficial to confront the insights and consolidate them into one AI technology. So you are pointing a very important risk to consider indeed, but technically this is addressable in many cases.
So another question that's been posed for the FDA is, as sponsors develop protocols and they're not sure, like how do they go about not getting all the way down the line and then getting ready to move forward, and it gets reviewed and they're like, nope, this isn't going to work. So like what can people that are developing these protocols do to be proactive about checking out what they're using?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think this is really a critical area we've been trying to stress a lot. And frankly, not just in the context of AI, but in the context of digital health technology as well, or innovative clinical trial design, is come and talk to us early. And we're providing different modalities to do that. Like for real world, for example, we have the real world steering committee that actually part of their job is to hear from outside entities about projects, about protocols that rapidly evolving, and they want to hear early from FDA before they go and invest and spend time on it. What would the regulator think about such approach? We do have those modalities. Actually, in our guidance, that's hopefully will be out by the end of this year, we're going to detail modalities for engagements. So if you have a thought, you have a questions, come to this entity. If you have a question about the data or digital health technology, there is a group that you should be in touch with. So we're relying a lot on that early interaction. I mentioned the real world steering committee. There is also the digital health steering committee, and now the AI governance council as well. So we're going to provide that mechanism and highlight it more and more. It's a great question, and we highly recommend early engagement. And frankly, for mutual learning as well, all right? Like we want to learn what's happening outside there to make us more robust regulators.
Well, it's been very enlightening for me, and we're wrapping up the end of the hour. So I think the future of AI, it looks promising, and it's full of a lot of revolutionary technology. And I think that we've seen that we need to ensure that it's safety and reliability. And I think that, what we didn't touch on, and which is kind of a given, is, the patient privacy part, the data security that will continue to have to be addressed. So, I think that as we conclude, it's really about developing robust standards and guidelines so that we can use AI in a safe and effective way. And I think that all three of you have done a wonderful job kind of laying that foundation. And so I appreciate it very much. As we wrap up, I need to give a couple credits. We'd like to thank Gilead for giving us a grant to support our educational webinars. We're very appreciative of that. A little heads up for what's coming next. In December, we will be having a webinar that will be a collaboration with Daniel Eisman and Luke Gilness, and they'll be talking about the scientific applications and ethics of cell and gene therapy. It's a little deeper dive than the last webinar that we had. And then a couple questions about CE credits. We can offer an attendance record for you. You may want to check with your professional organization to see if the event meets their requirements. This is eligible for 1 CE credit. SOCR does accept attendance documentation for recertification, and the topic presented today meets their criteria. If you're interested in receiving a certificate for today's webinar, please contact us at this email address, and we can provide you with that. Remember, to be eligible, you have to have watched the webinar in its entirety and complete the survey that will be available at the conclusion. And we do ask that you request these within 30 days of the webinar. So if you want to keep up with us and future educational offerings, we ask that you follow us on LinkedIn. And lastly, as you sign off today, we do ask that you complete the survey. We are continually looking for ways to improve our webinars and deliver relevant programming. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you for spending your lunch with us, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you in December. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.